Vitamin Water Zero Sugar has great taste, zero BS, and obviously, zero sugar. For those with zero room in their calendar. Zero patience for slow walkers. Those who get 0 hours of sleep on a Saturday night. Have zero filter, zero given, and zero interest in grabbing a plain, boring water. Grab a delicious Vitamin Water Zero Sugar today.
Raise the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an Enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. Start converting your B2B audience today. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started today at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
With the Walmart app, you can squeeze in those final days of summer and nail that back-to-school shopping list. So keep working on that tan and let Walmart Express Delivery handle the rest. Chromebooks, Clorox wipes, Sharpies, glue sticks, pens, pencils, and more. All delivered in as fast as an hour. So pour yourself another iced tea. Summer's not over. Last-minute back-to-school supplies delivered fast. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new. Subject to availability. Fees and restrictions apply.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week we're living the many ill-fated lives of Surgeon Cole Mason in the FMV interactive horror game Dead Reset from developers Wales Interactive and Dark Rift Horror. Cole finds himself held against his will in an underwater facility and being forced to extract a deadly and ever-evolving parasitic creature from a patient's abdomen. Naturally, this parasite breaks containment, and it will require Cole to die, and die again to gain the answers to his questions of what is this creature, where is he, and why can't he stay dead. And a thank you to Wales Interactive PR for providing us with codes for this review. So we haven't really covered any FMV games, that being because of the fact that they're not nearly as commonplace as they used to be. It's an interesting thing to see in 2025. We're getting a game that blends FMV, but also having an aspect to it that feels a little bit more modern, which is something, that was made very popular by games such as Until Dawn, right? This like notion of an interactive experience that is all about player choice and making a key decision at a junction point, and then that influencing the fate of either the protagonist or the other characters that are in that narrative. And so Dead Reset feels like just like a blending of that, but having clearly a very cinematic full motion video component to it that removes any player movement, if you will. It's all about watching the story unfold and then making a decision at a key point, as I said, to kind of just like basically decide the fate of the crew as a whole or for individuals themselves. Do you have much experience with like FMV games from back in the day?
Yeah, and Wales Interactive have done quite a few in many genres in recent years. They've kind of been the purveyors of the genre in the modern age, which has been the healthiest thing. I played stuff like Night Trap and Sewer Rats and stuff like that back in the day, and Christ, yeah, they're interesting, and they seem like great ideas and the concepts and all that, but yeah, you play them and it's like, nah, these aren't quite the same thing. I mean, the way it's evolved even with this, like how Wales Interactive have done it over the last decade or so. I think it was The Bunker that was the first game they sort of did in this sort of run of games. And yeah, and I've enjoyed them in all sort of genres, like the 5 Dates game, which is like funny, like for what it is, which is basically like one of those pandemic-esque sort of things of like using Zoom calls, video dates with people, and it being slightly dramatized. And then the sequel quite fun for that as well. But there's like a crime thriller called Late Shift, which is quite nice. They even had like Paul McGann for one, I think it was like an adventure one. I can't remember the name of it. But yeah, that was like quite good in terms of like the budget for it. The budgets have definitely gone up, or they've got better at sort of using the space. I think it's easier to obviously just do stuff in everyday houses and buildings that day, but when they've had to sort of go into the sci-fi, especially, as well, it's always going to be more ambitious in terms of what they're going to do. Mira and the Dragon Princess was the one I was thinking of just about a couple of years ago. It was like a comedy drama action sort of thing. Yeah, so I like that they go in different directions and try different genres, and I mean, even with the case of this one, they employ someone who's done a genre film before, much of the same cast as well. I think is so yeah, it's I've had plenty of experience with FMV games in the past, and especially the last few years because of Wales Interactive, and been quite fond of many of them as well. So yeah, it's if you take it for what it is as well with it, like, then they're more enjoyable. Yeah, I think it's going into it thinking video game in the traditional sense does not help at all.
I think that is key to the enjoyment of Dead Reset, which I think I've seen a little bit in terms of like the reviews that I've been reading. It's the type of thing where, like, me personally, I don't have a ton of experience with FMV, but at the same time, I go in knowing what to expect because of the fact that, I've experienced a little bit, but I know sort of like, generally speaking, like the vibe or the tone of them. So going into this, like, I understand that. And so I'm able to appreciate it for what it's doing in terms of evoking genre. And at the same time, being pretty consumed with, B movie sensibilities and hamming it up, which is pretty intrinsic, I think, to the FMV games and those experiences as a whole. And so I think also, though, like, one of the benefits that Dead Reset has, even for people that maybe like are not super into the vibe of FMV experience, is the fact that, it blends what happens to be like two of our favorite subgenres of horror, that being aquatic horror and body horror, right? So it has those two things really working for it in terms of the setting and the general premise of this monster, basically, that what does it do? It hatches and then it grows and it just wants to consume more and more. And thankfully, this is the type of thing where you get to blend that aquatic setting and the isolating and claustrophobic feeling of that, of being trapped in this single location. And at the same time, the notion you can't leave. But at the same time, you have this body horror monstrosity that, basically is just looking to consume as much juicy neck meat as possible. And we'll talk about it later on, but just like, it's very refreshing for me to play something that tonally has a lot of like B movie charm to it, but is one of those examples of somebody, of a crew and production value that understands the importance of quality practical work. But like I said, we'll chat about that in a little bit. But I guess for you, like, for first impressions of Dead Reset, I guess what stood out to you initially as maybe a positive in terms of like, hey, this is a more modern FMV game that's taking place within these subgenres of horror in a way that, is not super commonplace.
Yeah, so with this, and like certainly with the later sort of games from Wales Interactive's teams in the FMV space, it's very clear very quickly that they are not the same as like the interactive sort of stuff you would get on, say, Netflix. They are those experiences are very basic by comparison. Sure, they have the budget, but they aren't really designed for multiple choice and direction in the same way this is. I think the main thing is, like, I know the production values and has been quite good generally for what it is. Again, the budgets aren't huge, but everything looks pretty decent. I think that's the first thing you can notice with this. Obviously, it helps that you're getting pretty high definition visuals anyway. But yeah, it's got a good hook straight away of like the whole sort of just dropped in the moment of not being in the same place as the protagonist, with not knowing what you're doing, what's going on, and figuring it out as you go. So straight away, like, that little mystery thing of getting each of the little reveals out of the way of like, you got to do this, now this happens, and now this, the wrinkle effectively of, with the time looping and stuff. That whole sort of sequence up until like, the titles is like really well done. I think in sort of setting the scene nicely for, it feels like it flows quite nicely. I think when you get those choices, especially, they feel limited, I suppose, if you're thinking of it in video game terms. But I think the trick with that is trying to make them flow together better, so that the story doesn't feel too repetitive and too stitched together. I think this is the first time in a while where I've actually looked at it and thought, the seams aren't there as much as they used to be. The only real sort of noticeable thing with that is like the music, or background noise cutting out as they transverse from one scene to another, like that in the picking of it. But yeah, they give you good lead up, and little pregnant pauses just to establish that when your choices are made. It's just a much smoother experience, and it all comes from having these years doing these games now and really understanding the medium. That's important. And yeah, I think as a mystery is important for this story, and it offers plenty of that straight away.
Yeah, no, I think that for me, like my first moment of, I suppose, I don't even know if it was hesitation, right? Because I knew going in, this was going to be more of a traditional FMV experience, but like coming from a heavy background in playing games such as Until Dawn and naturally like Dark Pictures Anthology, a big part of those games with the decision making was actually having the agency to explore a world and get to interact with it in a way that I want to. So sitting down and watching essentially a movie and then only really getting to have an impact in one of two decisions that pops up periodically, I was kind of like, I wonder what that's going to be like, because of the fact that having the time loop aspect of it, it's like, okay, if I'm watching a majority of this, which is probably 90%, 95% if that of the experience, being in a time loop means you're going to be dying and dying and dying all over again. So you can gain more knowledge, and both in terms of the narrative, but also in terms of like the situations that are going to arise. And so my number one concern was not that I thought this was going to be like the scenarios are going to be like super complex. There's one of two fucking options for anything. But it was the thing where I was like, how many times am I going to have to rewatch this scene over and over? And like, that was my main thing, was like, is this going to go from being exciting or thrilling or just, enjoyable to how many times do I have to watch the scene play out? But what I was really appreciative of was the fact that through smart directing and editing, I think they filmed multiple angles for each of these, for a majority, I think, of these scenes and these interactions. So like that first chapter, when you're really just getting the bare bones feel of like, okay, you're in a time loop. Here's how it works. You need to experiment. If you don't try new things, then you might have this consequence, which can impact relationships, which we'll touch upon. But I think that just from a standpoint of like, is this a studio that knows how to make an FMV game in a way that is about repetition? Are they able to do that in a manner that does not like burn the player out, essentially? And that, I was very thankful to see, like, for the most part, that that's not an issue with Dead Reset. They really understood the way to retain, I suppose, players' attention span in that regard. Because for me, like, I was never like, oh, great, I get to watch this again, because of snappy editing, or again, just having multiple camera angles for the same thing. And also, like, you get to these points where you have to make 2 or 3 different series of decisions in a given scene. And it was the type of thing where it's like, at a certain point, if you've experimented enough, or if you've, failed enough through that experimentation, Cole himself or another character will like make a comment or reflect or react to that, which I think is, again, like a reward basically for that experimentation. You get a slight change, you get a slight new tidbit of information through that experimentation. So I think that was a strong first impression, that chapter 1, because of the fact that they make that very clear early on, which kind of like immediately put me at ease with what little sort of like worry I had, I suppose, going into Dead Reset.
Yeah, I mean, there are the two sort of issues you have with these kind of games: is the repetition of failure, or that it's too streamlined and too straightforward and too focusing straight ahead. And yeah, the time loop thing makes this feel like that would be a problem, and it doesn't happen, which is, as you said, fantastic that we actually get a story that works with that and understands the patience of the person playing. That you don't want to be seeing the same scenes from the same angles and the same cuts, and if they're different, performances as well, I think sometimes as well, like that. So you get slight variations, which is cool. Because I think the first time it happens where you think, oh, it's just the same scene again, and then you see how it's different in these small ways, like obviously because the character goes in with the same knowledge as you of what happened last time, and that's reflected in what he'll look at, your options end up being, and truncating some of those moments, and making sure you don't have to have the whole drawn out conversation again with certain things. It's great, and I think most of the time you get choices that make you can kind of guess where you need to go if you want to take a certain path. But because of this sort of structure you have to the game, in terms of like you have a limited time to answer outside of like the streamer mode that you can do, it means you again are, as protagonist, get to decide things on the fly, and you won't have time to think about the moment. I mean, yes, you could cheat effectively in many ways, but if you're going to do it pure, then you can go into it and have that sort of split decision sort of thing, like, oh, I've got to do it now, this, like that. And because they're just vague enough that you don't have all the information you need, and there's all these other things that you don't know about a lot of the time, especially early on, it's great to sort of see the results of it like that. There's a couple of times where you pick something, then it gets going, and you think, oh shit, I just realised what's going to happen, sort of thing. But it's that kind of story. It's part and point, which is the fun part. That could make a normal game feel pointless, I suppose, if you had that sort of option. But here it's just like, no, it works. I mean, if you're talking like time loop things, Deathloop did it well. For instance, in terms of normal games where you have, that time loop thing and how you manipulate it, and death being part of it effectively in your learning. But obviously, it's much, much, much more simple, in terms of what it's doing. But as a sort of interactive experience, it works wonders with that sort of small sort of set of ideas.
Yeah, I think that in the relative simplicity of it, it being you get to make one of two options, that really is though where the aspect of this, which again, it reminded me of the Dark Picture anthology games, because of the fact that Dead Reset, amongst its cast of, what is it, a total of like 6 characters or something like that, they have basically, like, you have a relationship meter, and certain decisions are going to affect those relationships either naturally positively or negatively. And so that is a factor that leads into like decision making of, is Cole going to form an alliance with this person? Is he going to deny the offer of an alliance? Is he going to do something that's in his own interest or the interest of another? And that, I think, is really what fuels the replayability here. I think the game has 4 different endings, right? And, I've mentioned it before, like, I'm not somebody that necessarily feels the need to go through and replay a game a handful of times to experience every ending. Like you've said plenty of times, like, oh, that's why YouTube exists for a reason. But in this case, for a game such as this, I actually would want to go back and replay this, and I plan to, because of the fact that you do learn more information, not only about the narrative, but you get to watch scenes play out differently. You get to see relationships flourish in a way that previously you didn't. And I find that for me, like the simplicity aspect of what you actually have to decide between, and it being relationship focused and character focused in that regard, is one of the things that actually makes it a little bit more worthwhile. And at the same time, like, I don't know, how long did it take you to beat this game? I think it took me 2 hours, maybe 2.5. Like, it was relatively short, maybe 2.5 for me, but it was the type of thing where I was like, oh, okay, I got one ending. Now I want to go back and immediately replay it to see how I can flesh out another character relationship, or see if I can uncover a new kernel of information about either the facility, the monster, what have you. And at the same time, at least for the ending that I got, it was quite satisfying in this very bleak body horror kind of way that was perfectly wonderful in, I suppose, in just how fucked up it was. But I think like overall, like that relationship meter, if you will, is something that I really liked because of the fact that not every character, like a character death does not spawn from every single decision that you make regarding someone else.
No.
Early on, that can be one of the very first ramifications of a decision that you make. But that is mostly, I think, just to teach the player, like, hey, if you aren't thinking a couple chapters ahead, this might end up being the fate of one of these characters. And the further into the game you get and the more survivors that are left standing, like their life becomes more in the balance rather than right up front where you're like, oh, well, maybe I don't want to form an alliance with this person. They immediately get killed. And then you're like, okay, well, I guess that doesn't really matter then because I don't care about that character. But the fact that the stakes get raised the further into the game that you get in terms of those characters and the more chances you or more experimentation in terms of like the decisions you make, you get to reveal some sides to characters that were not blatantly typecasted, which I think is one of the best compliments I can probably give to the game because of the fact that we talked about, you know, it having this B-movie sensibility. It hams it up from time to time. You kind of could be lulled into this sense of like, I'm just along for this ride. Everybody you can take at face value, but as we can both attest, the further into the game you get opportunities to actually see some growth in characters and how they either reflect on your decisions and how they will either rise to an occasion or either just prove to you exactly who they are. But that ends up being a pretty fun sort of like investigation to have further into this game, which makes the back half, I found just as rewarding as the beginning of it, to be honest.
Yeah, it does just feel, you know, in that beginning, it's very compact and rapid in what it's doing in sort of establishing everything, you know, that it needs to establish. And in doing so, it does just leave a lot on the table for you to discover as you go on. And again, because you and Cole are both in the same situation of like, you don't know these people, you don't know what's going on. Your instincts personally towards each character are going to be based on the interactions you have with them in the first sort of half an hour, because you know some characters are very aggressive, you know, very murdery. In fact, in some cases, and like that's going to make you think of those characters in a certain way. Absolutely. You could suggest that maybe it gets a little bit silly with the amount of but did you know this about this person thing in terms of trying to sort of swerve. But you know, for this kind of story, you need it a bit more than if it was just a straight film. If it was a straight film and they were doing that, it's like, yeah, come on. It's like, we get it. Yeah, you want twists and turns, but this is getting a bit over the top. But yeah, here you can kind of forgive that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it has the benefit of the, if you will, like the gamification of a film. Essentially, right? And so I think that like you can make those certain concessions that you otherwise for a film would not. And yeah, you know, that's an interesting aspect of this. Like if this was just a straight up film, would we have the same impression of it? But because of the fact that we have a direct say in the outcomes, that's probably a testament to this being better suited as a game, because at least what I found is that while it was relatively straightforward in terms of like what the overall sort of story is about and whatnot, the ways in which this is gamified, I think, give this more notability, I suppose, in just like the storytelling aspect of it. And I think also, like, I just keep coming back to the production value for this game. Like, I thought that it was a peg above what I have previously, even how limited that might be, like with FMV games, where, you know, you get to actually see a set design that I felt was like doing what you want a set of a aquatic horror film to be, right? Which is that you have this suffocating industrial setting. You've got this sort of like mad science component to it, but also, and we'll talk about the monster design probably in a little bit after we come back from the break, but like you have practical work that it might look slightly ropey at times, but I think that overall, like, there is a good attention to the monster moments in this that truly need to shine if you're going to go this kind of like body horror parasitic monster route. And I think that it follows a really nice pacing and kind of like monster evolutionary arc that is rival to how it's approached in films, right? You start with the, it's going all the way back to Alien. You start with this little thing, it hatches, and then you see the horrific ways in which it grows and evolves, and getting to follow that sort of like evolutionary scale for that creature is satisfying in the most grotesque and bloody and gory ways possible, which is exactly what, we want from something like this.
I was going to say, it's just like, it's not afraid to be gory and very practical led, and that, as much as it's a sniffy thing to say, is that the amount of like, movies of the same level budget wise probably that have, or even bigger budgets that have crap CG blood. It's just like, I get not everyone has the same skill for doing that sort of stuff, but it's like, it does make a difference, I think, in helping you sort of feel, especially in this game, with the sort of world they've built, and it all being grimy and industrial, and the blood. If it had been CG on top of that, it would have just been like that. It's like, sure, there's goofiness to some of it because of the practical work, but as is true with much of that from the past, it doesn't really matter that much because it's more believable than this thing isn't here. And I can kind of tell this thing is a thing. Like puppetry and practical effects in general will give it a little bit more sense of believability just because it is simply there, in a way that other stuff isn't. And then you can touch things up with CG to make it, to pretty things up, so to speak. And it's not so in your face in terms of use of CGI in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately, like, if you're going to make a monster story, if that monster is completely laughable in a way that it's like, okay, why did you even bother doing this to begin with? And so I think that, it comes back also, I think, overall to like what I was really a huge fan of, which was the episodic nature of Dead Reset, the fact that it's broken into 8 different chapters, which, we keep calling it a movie, but that gives it this sort of, TV episodic feel to it, which I think is perfect because it not only like gives you that hard out for, okay, I'm going to take a break from this, or I'm going to do this or that. It also allows each of the chapters, I think, to strike a very different, maybe not like tone, but just like narrative purpose. Early on, like I've said, that first chapter I think is probably the best first chapter I've played in a game from like a tutorial standpoint, because of the fact that it so efficiently really does summarize what the experience is. It informs the player of experimentation being rewarded, wanting to take risks. You get a feel for overall how that repetition of death is handled. But then moving forwards, like, it's not just a series, and I think this is an easy kind of like oversimplification maybe that people could have of this type of experience when it's FMV with a monster and decision making involved. People could very simply think like this is a game where it's like the crux of it every chapter is, do I go left or I go right and the monster's running at me type of a thing. You know what I mean? Like very simplistic. It's like what I would imagine most people think like video game novelizations are, where it's like, I'm going to read the Resident Evil novel and it's like, am I going to read a paragraph and a half of them? And then I reloaded and then I fired 2 rounds and then I back, like, you know what I mean? Like the step by step of basically spelling out what a video game is, but with words. And here, like, I could see people thinking like, oh, it's just going to be a series of left, right, runaway decisions. But really, like, each of the chapters, I think, does a good job of differentiating between monster movie genre moments, but then also like character development. And there's entire chapters where you might not even encounter the monster. And that's when more plot development happens. That's when those relationships that you've been affecting with your decisions for the past, hour and a half or so, really come to like their boiling point, essentially. And those were the moments that I think I was really surprised by just how well they played later on in the game, because they'd been building to that the whole time. Again, it's important to have these decisions that are relationship based. It's important to not to have the crux of those just be somebody lives or somebody dies, because once you get to that end chapter and you're faced with this predicament of the natural thing of, well, there's 3 of us and there's 2 seats on this escape pod. Like that's when the relationship dynamics of those survivors becomes the most interesting, I think, and actually has a good amount of payoff. Now I can only speak to the one ending that I had. But in terms of you talking about like a character that was very aggressive and very violent right out of the gate, like that character in particular for me had a moment in the end game that was like surprising. It was something I couldn't have expected based upon how they presented for the first 2/3 of the experience. And I found that to be very rewarding for a narrative that I wasn't expecting to be as, character driven, given, it's a game about a monster that is trying to eat your face. So that was, I think, a real testament to just like the gamification of a movie working quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, it sort of enhances what, if you did take it as a movie, it probably wouldn't be as memorable for you. These are things that, the sort of film that I've watched where you go, yeah, it was okay for what it is. Derivative, I suppose you could say, in terms of what it's doing. But because it's putting you in the seat of a character, effectively, that changes everything. It's why video games as a medium are so interesting, because you had that different. I think we only mentioned this recently. The difference between reading a book, watching a movie, and playing a game. It's just about how your involvement in that world that you're in. You're just an observer. With TV, books, to a degree, you have some sort of something about it. You can interpret things in a certain way, and your imagination can do some work. But yeah, games and by extension, interactive films can give you that. Give you a bit more immersion. Now, I don't think it would work for like every kind of film, ever. It would ruin the point of certain films, absolutely. But I think you can certainly design a film that still feels like a film, but is playable to this degree, and works. And given the sort of thing of the crux of this story being about a time loop thing, and Lord knows there've been plenty in video games, it's perfect sort of fodder for a video game format of a film. That you can just sort of make decisions quickly, and there are consequences that aren't too frustrating. That they play into the story. So yeah, it's a good way of using the two things together.
Yeah, and I think that what was nice to see periodically, because again, when you come back to this notion of the time loop and whatnot, like the wrinkle that they add is that, there's basically this connection between you and the monster and this device. And, when there's like this power surge within the facility, basically it starts a new respawn point as the story is progressing. And so you get to that point, and then you get basically what reminds everybody of the Until Dawn sort of like visions that you get, where it's like, okay, I get to see a brief glimpse into the future, and that might be able to help me basically influence my decision-making because of one of 4 different brief little flashes on screen that you see that basically is a clip that's been highly edited. So it's like, oh, okay, there's going to be a combat scene with a monster, or I'm going to have an interaction with another character that maybe turns violent. And so it doesn't spell things out too much for you, but it does inform you just enough of like, okay, hey, maybe like pay attention a little bit more to your decision making. But again, like when you're talking about an episodic game that's dealing with this heavily repetitive notion of dying and then reliving, like that was one of those things that I think does a good job of like creating milestones in an experience that is pushing forwards the narrative, but also indicating like these moments of real significance that are coming up when there's actually stakes involved. So again, that was like one of those little touches that I think, again, was able to take a mechanic that is explained and is easily understood in the first 10 minutes of the experience, and just kind of like reworking it a little bit to the degree that you get to have this sort of like updating, well, not necessarily like changing things all that drastically from what has been instilled in the player from, again, that like opening tutorial chapter. I guess we could take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll chat a little bit more about the writing, directing, and performances, and we can talk about more about the monster in some depth, because again, like that monster, I was quite fond of, and the sort of practical work that goes into bringing that to life. So we can chat about those aspects and some more in a moment. And we're back from our break. And as you had mentioned earlier in our chat, this is a game that is from a team that has previously worked together in, feature films. So that being director and co-writer Stuart Spark and writer Paul Butler, who had previously collaborated for a film called How to Kill Monsters. And it actually featured many actors that are present in Dead Reset. They also did a film called Book of Monsters, I believe. But yeah, so I guess what I would say is, not having watched either of those previous films, is that you do get the sense that like these are actors that are very comfortable with one another to the degree that it makes sense. Hey, turns out they've actually worked together before. I don't know that means that I always necessarily found like some of the B-movie sensibility, hamminess of characters and the portrayal of characters to always work. But I will say that this lacks the sort of like rough edges of, a very bare bones indie kind of horror film. If, something straight to streaming, right? It doesn't always work for me, but at least people are very like genuine in their performances, I think. And there's that comfortability that I think sells what they have to work with in a way that it works well for the context of this game more often than not, I found. How about you? What did you think about the sort of directing and performances here?
Yeah, as you say, I think it does help that they're all quite familiar with each other, and it does make for a more comfortable group. I think you can definitely tell the ones that have worked together more, in that regard. There is that sort of ease of it. Our protagonist, Cole, played by Daniel Freys, he's obviously important to how we view a lot of this, and he gets a lot of like big facial expressions and things like that to sort of, because he has to really convey what we want to know about him and his character enough that we can kind of inform our decision based on that a bit. And it's a difficult character to do, I think, with a story like this, where obviously you can make choices and changes. Part of the fun of the writing here is that your choices do make sense, even if because of the time constraints in many of them. With what I know and what's going on, this is the decision to make in this moment. So it doesn't affect the character too much, and that would have been like the big problem, I think, if you had a character who ends up doing wildly wrong things. But they've made sure to put everything in that makes them, Cole feel like he's doing not necessarily a sensible thing, but something that would feel right in that moment. And Daniel Freys has a lot to do there with that, in terms of how he sort of puts that forward in those facial expressions, giving you just enough without giving it all away, sort of thing, and playing it too far one way or the other, which would have been, as I said, very difficult to do. And as I said with the other actors, you've got so much of this idea of them being one type of character, and like obviously opinions on them changing depending on what you learn about them and how their attitudes are, and the context of why they would be like this to you in one way and in particular. So that's, as I said, all of this is very tricky to do anyway in a multi sort of pathway sort of story. And I think they handle it fairly well. It's not blow your socks off acting, but it's not terrible either. I've definitely seen acting in low budget horror that's far, far below this. And I think even in terms of like the direction, there's some really decent shots in here. Like in terms of, I think early on when Cole's having to go through all those cable tunnels and stuff like that. Sure, it's just we've seen that in other films before, but it's still well shot for what it is, and conveys a sort of sense of unease of like something could be coming. I think those are all important things to get right. And because, as you said straight away, it's like it's got the B-movie stuff to it, you only have a certain level of expectation with it, and I think it kind of surpasses that. It's actually higher quality than I would have expected for that. And that's just to say because it's a niche within a niche here. It's like it's a horror movie that's now a game, effectively an interactive film on consoles. And so obviously that works for people, and it's popular with streamers, these games, because they have those modes specifically for them so they can have audience interaction, and that's a big reason they continue to be successful. But it doesn't mean that they can't be. It does mean that the audience isn't going to be huge because it is that niche. But still, I think even with that, it's really well put together for in all those departments for what it is, and which sounds backhanded. I know it is just a case of like, even with the expectation of like B movie, low budget, it's surprised me.
No, I think that I agree in terms of, when early on these performances, there's nothing indicating like, oh, this is going to blow me away from like a character standpoint. Right. And I think that when the performances truly shine is when, again, you yourself are more invested based upon the decisions that you've been making. So like I had mentioned that scenario towards the end game where it's like, okay, we've got this predicament. There's 3 seats on the escape, or 2 seats on the escape pod. There's 3 of us. So like, that more or less you're going to be building to a moment that the stakes are going to be that, right? No matter what kind of experience you're talking about, when there is, you're trapped in, whether it's a spaceship or an underwater facility, like, and you're building to that penultimate moment. And, that predicament is one that's very familiar, but you don't get the sort of the same emotional investment in the decision making unless the game is not only put in the character development work to that point, but also, like you, in this case, it being live action, you have to have performances that are able to sell that at the moments where it matters most. And when you get to those moments periodically throughout this game, like that's when I found these actors were really able to give the most when it was the most important. For all the stuff we've said about it being, very B movie coded and hammy at times in terms of that early dialogue, like there's a lot in that first chapter, I think, in terms of establishing the various like tropes of characters that you see in genre films from everybody that's involved in that opening scene, which is all fine. But I think it sets this precedent of like, well, nobody's ever going to evolve past this blatant trope that's presented before you. And so for me, like to find certain pivotal moments where these actors were able to really give these performances that made you view their characters either in a different light, or you get to view this character like rising to the occasion. That's when the game, I think for me, like really utilized probably the familiarity that a lot of these actors had, if not with one another, with the creatives that were helming it, that being the writers and directors. And I think that, in talking about the direction of this game, like, again, it's not only just the good production value and set design, but like they're able to capture this environment in a way more often than not that is the more interesting way to shoot a very familiar environment. Like, again, that comes back to the repetitive nature of it. You're not going to subject players to watching the same cutscene over and over and over and over. I mean, some people do that and, you get burnt out on that. But here, like tackling those multiple angles through editing, through smart direction and whatnot, like that allows you to have to capture a familiar, call it generic if you want, environment, but doing it in more dynamic ways to make it visually appealing in a way that typically, given how often it's used in horror films and whatnot, is not. And so they really do, I think, go to the extra length to making sure that something that's familiar is still like interesting to look at.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think presentation wise as well, like keeping like the interactive stuff quite streamlined in how it looks, like it's just having that little simple sort of bar that decreases and having the 2 choices just be very almost like where the subtitles would be, sort of thing. It doesn't interrupt the flow of what you're doing in the way that you expect, and that's very important for the storytelling as well, to keep engaged with the story. And if you have like big klaxony things stopping the action every 5 minutes to make a choice and big thing in the middle of the screen, it's not going to. It is going to feel more like one of those Netflix ones, and it is going to feel like this a smoother sort of thing that we got here. And yeah, I think the game stuff is not so much hidden, but like it is just integrated in a way that makes it feel a lot smoother, even smoother than a lot of Wales Interactive's earlier sort of effort.
Yeah, that was the thing what you had mentioned earlier about the only real sticking point is like those momentary pauses when you've made your decision and it's like the game is basically like loading the actual visuals to go along with that decision. That's like the only real moment of pause that's ever given, and it's only ever like a fraction of a second. So I think for me, like, it opened me up more to the idea of playing these FMV games because of the fact that, oh, you can actually have more variety in what you're seeing. You don't have to have the same like awkwardness in terms of like lagging or loading or this or that. Sometimes that is the transition between various scenes. And, part of that might be the episodic nature here, where it's like you have that moments, you have that big cliffhanger kind of reveal, if you will, and then it cuts to, the next chapter, and that being the sort of like natural break point. And at the same time, it being a relatively short experience means that going into the next chapter, you're hard pressed to like have an instance where you don't remember what happened the previous chapter, because it's like, it's like a 3-hour experience or something like that. But I suppose before we wrap up, we need to chat a little bit more about the monster and the practical effects and the gore that goes into, bringing this horror to life. I shared briefly my thoughts on it. But how did you find overall, the production value, the monster design, and how it's handled leading up to that final confrontation with it?
So I think it's a thing that really starts strong, gets a little silly, gets better, sort of thing, which ironically is very much like the Alien model. When you think about it, is we had the face hugger, that was great. Then the chest burster, which, the scene is iconic, but the model, it looks increasingly silly every year that passes. And then of course, the Alien becomes that. Obviously, this is not that, but it's when you get that sort of thing at the beginning where they're trying to do the surgery on the thing and the woman, and you have the tendrils coming out and like that, and still having that mystery about what it is. It is kind of intriguing. They're like, oh, okay, so what's going on here, sort of thing, and it does make you wonder what it's going to look like. The small form of it is very, like thing on a wheel, basically, like that. It looks like just a lump of stuff, which it's fine. It's fine, but I think it would look far worse if it didn't then go causing the carnage it does, which is important, I think. So some of that sort of inherent silliness of the design means that it actually gets to be quite vicious and violent in those moments afterwards, and you at least think of it as a dangerous thing like that from that point on, in terms of what it can do to them, that devastating choice of like just seeing everyone just getting massacred in one of the like that. But I was glad they did carry on and let it evolve and turn into that bigger thing where it's performed by a person in a suit, and it's nicely designed. And I suppose the only issue you'll ever have with that is you're always going to be thinking of Alien, because so much of what they're doing is Alien, and so many stories have done the same, in the past, and you're always then looking at the design thinking, well, is it going to be like Alien? And let's be honest, nothing is going to be that. Geiger's design is just what it is, but I think for the budget, and it's one of those things that are great about like what they do with like the practical and the core in here is just it feels earnest, like that. And so even when it's at its silliest points, it still feels effective, like that, because of the way they present it and the way they handle it. And then when you get to that bigger one, it does feel more intimidating and more of a challenge, and looks intimidating in a way that it didn't when it was little.
No, I mean, I love that trajectory, right? Which we've now mentioned several times in terms of like Alien being the clear influence point there. But I think that, I can appreciate the evolutionary phases that it takes and whatnot. And yeah, like that initial one, I think once it basically hatches is like a little silly, but at the same time, I think that what allows it to really grow as an entity and to be threatening in the various ways is like how they're able to incorporate the various set designs as well. You know, once you get to that finale at the end, like it's properly monstrous and you still get to see like the tendrils wrapping around people's limbs and breaking necks and all these things. But I think also it's the ways in which they're able to utilize the direction overall for Dead Reset, which is utilizing the scenery, utilizing those like cramped, basically like tunnel environments or vent environments, but also the lighting, which, you know, it's true of any monster movie. It's like, you know, if you're going to be able to use good lighting or lack thereof in terms of like having these very dark and shadowy environments, like you can hide a lot of the shortcomings that are going to be there for any type of like rubber suit monster, if you will. But I think that ultimately, like, it's the utilization of presenting it that is just as strong as the practical effects there, which I think are quite good again for what it is. And you get to see this really like grotesque, monstrous tentacle monster that also like has this weird human kind of like skull that's split down the mouth and everything. Like it's properly fucked up in the body horror way, which I love. But I think that, you know, ultimately what is also really well done and speaks to, again, like the practical work here is the gore that's in this game and, you know, the bodily dismemberment, which again, like that for horror sickos is what can propel players to really want to experiment because, you know, if you make stupid decisions, you see all this horrible shit happen to Cole or to other characters and whatnot. And that in and of itself, I found to be quite impressive periodically throughout it. Like something as simple as in one instance, I turn my back to run from the monster and it picks up what looks like a hubcap piece of metal and whips it at my back. And then Cole falls over and he like spits up blood and the camera cuts to his back and you just see his spine like protruding from his back. And then the monster walks up and like rips the rest of his spine out, or watching it rip another character in half and you get this sickly, squishy bodily dismemberment. It's like, it's properly disgusting in the best way. And like, again, like the practical work, I think it sells this in a way that's rewarding in that regard and just shows like, you know, the craftsmanship and the love that went into something like this. 'Cause how easy would it be for each of the deaths to simply be the character's about to get his head squished, the camera pans to a nearby wall and they just throw some, you know, fake blood on the wall, which happens once or twice in this, but this game really does have those body horror payoffs that you want from this type of experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's great fun, and I think the genre is like the perfect one for these sort of games, you know, the FMV style games. As much as Wales Interactive have branched out and done all sorts, I think you can definitely tell the difference in terms of what works and what doesn't. And unless you've like got a really smart like, gimmick or format for other genres, it's hard. The dates games, for instance, are like smart because of what they utilize, like the Zoom style dating. But so it's less so for something like, say, Late Shift, which, it's a crime drama. It doesn't quite feel as connected. I think, horror, as you said, the Dark Pictures and Until Dawn games like that have proven like it's perfect for this sort of choice-based stuff. And I think also because you think of like B-movie style stuff, and one of the great delights of that, and it's something I'm going to do a lot of myself next week at a film festival, is go and see lots of like 80s movies with practical effects that are cheap and cheesy and cheery, but with people who will enjoy that stuff, and it'll be the experience of being in a place with lots of people enjoying that stuff together. And because this is an interactive game where anyone can just sit down and watch it with you effectively, and just you can make decisions on the fly, or say streaming it if you wish and doing the same thing, it does have like a communal thing to it that feels right for that kind of film and that kind of style. So it's got the right things going for it in that regard. And I love that about it, that it does, whether you enjoy it as a film or not necessarily, that's to be debated. But I think as an experience like that, it's, especially with other people, it's great fun.
I think that the ability to capture that communal like midnight showing of a monster movie aspect in an FMV game that does, really relish player choice. That's quite a success, I think, for, Dead Reset and Wales Interactive and Dark Rift Horror to really nail, because, again, like my initial, I don't want to say skepticism, but like my initial thing going into Dead Reset, I was like, how well is this going to be able to bridge that gap between film, game, and not having the aspect that, again, made those like Until Dawn and Dark Picture Anthology games work so well, which is that, these are games still. You still get to have the normal sense of control. And I was worried about what was going to be lost in an experience that did not have that aspect at all. And I think that the approach here that was taken is kind of like the blueprint for how you should be doing FMV experiences moving forwards. And, I can't speak to how well that's going to work in other genres because of the fact that, we have some pretty inherent horror bias, shocking, which really allows us to take in this world and get a lot more out of things like those monster designs and whatnot, and the gore and things along those lines, but also like the character development, I suppose. So maybe what I'm saying doesn't actually make sense, because if I watch a sci-fi focused one or another one and it has the same attention to character development, maybe I'll be just as invested in that. But I think that, to play around with these various subgenres and blend them together into something such as this and it work as well as it does, is quite a testament to this, merger of genres. And for a, genre of games, that being FMV, that is not terribly prevalent these days, like this kind of makes the case for, maybe other developers kind of like take a page out of this book and realize like, oh, you can still tell these compelling stories. You just need to make sure that you're going to back it up in a way that justifies maybe not the repetitive nature that's found here with the reviving and whatnot, but you need to have multiple outcomes that, are backed up by a good production value, good editing, smart direction, and just like a bevy of, I suppose, characters and being able to influence those relationships as you do in, a typical video game.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, but that's going to do it for our chat this week on Dead Reset, a game that, surprised us and was really nailing a sort of a blending of subgenres that we don't see all that often. But, when it's a aquatic body horror focused experience, FMV or not, like pretty sure bet we're going to get on with that just okay. But yeah, this was a great game to kind of dive into and chat about. And as always, my friend, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Okay, my man. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.
That's the sound of the fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron and the quiet confidence of ultra-smooth handling. The elevated interior reminds you this is more than an EV. This is electric performance redefined.